There we go, and we are on. So, hi everyone. This is just a sort of conversation with myself and Tim about the 2022 documentary that's on a well-known streaming service. So, both Tim and I wrote some articles on this well-known streaming service documentary a couple of months back now, and I've asked him to have a chat with me just on our sort of takes on that, what we can sort of see as practitioners within the health and safety field, and what we can see that's relatable, and some of the things that we see within our own sort of journeys and what we've done in the past. So for me, I think it's a great documentary. It's full of sort of useful information for both safety and non-safety professionals to learn from. And I'd even go as far as to say that it's a great training aid and a tool that's packed with sort of relevant, useful information and lessons. In fact, Tim in his article it says that there's no better thing to do than just gather the management team round and watch this documentary. So we're just going to get into it. So the documentary sort of starts with people gathering in a departure lounge, and there's passengers waving to sort of people leaving on the aircrafts, and then there's a family running down the travelator. There's a bit of a voiceover that gives a sort of introduction to the documentary, and it's interesting. Sort of one of the things that the voiceover, which is a Wall Street journalist, he goes on to say is that most people feel comfortable flying. And he then goes on to say that he'd say that the majority of people have gotten accustomed to how safe the system is. So Tim, just on that, sort of like your experiences with dealing with clients and dealing with organizations, do you feel that people do become accustomed to safety systems, or they sort of take it for granted?
Well, yes. I mean, the obvious one is with airlines, and they always say that if you have a chat with an engineer, maintenance engineer, you'd never get in a plane, and if you have a chat with a baggage handler, you'd never put anything in the hold, and all that stuff that goes on, and we're completely oblivious to it because we are crossing our fingers and working the odds. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So. I must say straight up, I don't really know an awful lot about aviation. I've done a little bit of work with some aviation firms and some baggage handling companies as well, for that matter. But I'm hardly an aviation expert. You need Sidney Decker. I think he can actually fly. I think he's actually got a pilot's license, hasn't he, for the jumbo?
Really? Wow, fascinating. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think people do take certain aspects for granted, and then they take risks in organizations. Certainly I see that with my own sort of pair of eyes, and the sort of people I interact with. They take things for granted until then obviously something goes wrong, and then the questions are asked. So what do you think, Tim, that the sort of company were good at? Just talk us through the sort of highlights that you picked up from this documentary.
Oh yeah, to give an overview of the documentary. I mean, we used to say back in the day, if it ain't a Boeing, I ain't going, or I think that was the phrase, wasn't it? And they had a reputation for excellence all around, really, as for reliability and so on. And the documentary makes clear that things changed significantly when there was a merger with, I think it was McDonnell Douglas. Correct me when I get my facts wrong here. And McDonnell Douglas, a much more commercially driven organization. So and initially there's this controversy up there in Seattle. Headquarters are moved to Chicago, I believe. The video suggests, the film suggests, to keep the management decision makers away from the engineers who kept knocking on the door saying, I can't believe you've decided this, and I can't believe you've just done that. And things degrade. And for me, and the thing that really leapt off the page was that whole piece that I'm very familiar with from hundreds of organizations, where with the learning culture piece, I think best exemplified by Matthew Said's book, Black Box Thinking, where he contrasts, interestingly, aviation, but he means airside, not maintenance, with hospitals, I think, and medicine. And it's initially it's suggested in the film, anybody who spots anything is lauded. Anybody who says, I'm not comfortable with this, are we sure that this is right, is lauded, praised, valued. But this then becomes, as they focus on the share price, so I think McDonnell Douglas management encouraged the share price to be the thing that they all valued. So I'll get behind that. And if that's going up, we're all doing a good job. And soon problems, especially written problems, become a hindrance to that. And then a blame culture, and shoot the messenger thing comes in, and suddenly that learning culture is lost. And as you see so often, I've seen it 1,000 times, that learning culture is manifest in the vans on the way home and in the canteen. And after an event, it's all like I'd have bloody told them if they just asked me. I knew that was going to happen. And it seems to me a lot of that knowledge was left on the shop floor. So for me, what was really interesting was, as my article says, a very, very simple morality play about a Faustian pact with the stock market. And eventually 2 planes crash in almost identical circumstances. The accident investigation ends up with a fine of, was it 2.5 billion, essentially. And my worry, and the last bit of my article says, as a Boeing has crashed recently, not in identical circumstances and in very different circumstances and potentially unrelated, except that what we do know is that cultures, when they go wrong in 1,000 different ways and manifest themselves in 1,000 different ways. And I think that the last line I wrote was "Happy Holidays," wasn't it, or something like that? Because it takes years, if not decades, once you've got it wrong, to get it right again.
Yeah,
that's my summary of the whole film. I hope you agree with that, Scott.
I absolutely do. Yeah, it's a good summary. We seen in the documentary that there was a number of workers that said they worked in the company for sort of decades. I think 32 decades was the type of thing. Sort of people saying a culture of mutual trust, working together, building a quality product that everyone can be proud of. It's a sort of family affair where people looked out for each other and they looked out for Boeing. And there's this sort of sense of belonging. How do you think that went so drastically wrong overnight, or did it? I know you're talking about it was over time.
Nothing goes wrong overnight, does it? In a culture, it takes ages to change. It takes ages to change it back from a good one to a bad one. That takes a while too, although it's quicker than going from bad to good. But as I've just said, it seems clear cut, and I'm sure we could get any number of lawyers or fast talking senior executives to say no, simplistic nonsense. But it seems that the merger was the key thing, and an organization that genuinely was focused on excellence in all respects then merged with one that was much more commercial. And that commercial bent meant that, as I said, the share price suddenly becomes the be all and end all. An Airbus client, actually, Airbus come in and do ever so well, and suddenly market share is compromised, and there's a push to innovate and stay ahead of the market and all this, and instead of trying to do that, ideally by being even better than Airbus's new planes, they sought something more cost effective than perhaps the way they should have done it, and that didn't work. And then you're looking at innovations that mean you don't need to train the pilots of potential customers. You don't need to go through quite so many regulations. And as you know, you ended up with pilots, experienced pilots flying planes with an incredibly critical safety feature that they didn't know anything about.
Yeah,
I believe, and I know you know this field so much better than I do, Scott, but my understanding was quite a lot of the pilots didn't even know that there was an innovation, let alone how to use it.
Yeah, just going back to the mergers and acquisitions that you talked about just a second ago. Have you seen that in any organisations sort of recently or in the past, where two organisations came together and it's sort of safety was such a laser focus for the organisation before, and then it's sort of gone out the window?
Yes, but
Yeah.
I'll flip the question to safer territory if I could, and talk about, when there's a merger. Often what you find is you've got an existing client, you've worked with them for years, they've acquired or merged with a company who are nowhere near as good as they are, and your job is to try and help the new company catch up. And you see that quite a lot, and the bemusement in the management. We've always done it this way. It's not that bad, is it? I mean, I know it's not that the figures aren't great, are they? But they're not that bad, are they? Well, are they? And so you're going in the opposite direction. But you have the odd horrible experience, when you're working with a company and they're merged with by somebody really hard-nosed. I guess a similar thing with Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And you go in to do presentation 3 for the strategy, and all your friends that invited you in the first place, they've gone, they've been replaced, and they were given their marching orders and told to clear their desks. And you got the new people, and you say, well, the incredibly important win-win aspect of culture is, can I stop you there? There's nothing wrong with our culture. Well, it's not great. And I haven't quite been thrown out of a window yet, but it's you certainly. I've had wind chill, and I've certainly had some chilly receptions from the new management team.
Oh, I'm glad you've not been thrown out of a window.
If looks could kill, though,
What we talked about the blame part. Why would an organisation seek to blame its talent then? Why do you think that would occur?
Oh, ABC analysis. If you call it ABC analysis, because it's inconvenient. Because if you get into a blame mentality, the messenger is the first person shot. And so people who rock the boat. There's again, I'm talking from memory here, but I've got a memory that the person who complained loudest about Piper Alpha before it happened afterwards wasn't lauded as a soothsayer and somebody of wisdom and perception. They were kind of blackballed, and my understanding is, and you often find that just because you're right doesn't get you very far if the prevailing culture is wrong.
I see that in my children, sort of young children, 7 and 5. One will blame the other when the other's not even in the room, or like it happened this morning actually. Who made all this mess on the floor? Oh, it was the other one. Well, you're the only one that's been eating the egg sandwich and there's egg on the floor. So you see it, from an early age. What can organisations do then in order to sort of not have that blame culture? Because we're talking about, it's all about culture, this, isn't it?
Oh, well, for me, culture is king for me, and that's my thing. But before we skip on, I've got the Bob Hope story.
Go on.
The Bob Hope is in Las Vegas. His wife turns up unexpectedly, catches him in bed with a showgirl, and he sits up and says, "This isn't me." And he didn't mean this is out of character. He meant I'm somebody else.
Yeah.
And afterwards, he explained it was the best excuse I could come up with at the time. And anyway, that's so. What do you do? I honestly think cultures are based on 3 things. We often say, if I can get an accurate answer to these 3 questions, I know how many people you're likely to hurt, or these days as we focus on health, make ill. And the first one is your systems and procedures. If you haven't hit diminishing returns with that, well, get stuck in and employ top professionals and listen to what they suggest and integrate things and get your flags and your ISOs. The second one, I think, as we've already discussed, is learning. I just think nothing is more important than having a learning culture for in itself, because the front line will come up with ideas that can make making money without hurting people easier and more effective. But also because, as Andrew Hopkins' mindful safety culture, there's always things going wrong. So it's a constant process of continuous improvement and proactively identifying those before they hurt somebody. And if you have got the workforce and they're the experts, if you've got them actively involved in that learning and continuous improvement process, that's empowering and involving. And for me, that's the third bit: how switched on and involved are the workforce. So that learning focus, that genuine learning focus, as we've seen with Boeing, I think it's a classic case study. They were engaged, they were switched on, they were proud. I didn't see, you might know this, Scott, but I didn't see the KPIs that I'm really interested in: turnover of the best staff, absenteeism, presenteeism, creativity, above the line behaviors, those sorts of things. But I bet they were really high. Not turnover, the others, sorry.
Yeah, I used to work for an organisation, and their viewpoint from the top was, if people leave, they would just replace them. And it's like, well, actually, you can't replace the experience and the years that person has acquired, and you can't just replace that overnight. It takes years to build it, and it's it's a bit like what one of the captains was saying in the documentary about, not telling us about this information about this particular system was disrespectful. I find that disrespectful as well. So why do you think that they didn't sort of try and understand the point of failure? Why do you think they just sort of blamed things? Do you think that just comes back to what you were saying, or do you think there was deeper issues around about? Because they could have grounded the aircraft, couldn't they, on the first crash? And I think they chose, again, profits probably over anything else.
Well, I mean, we're second guessing now, aren't we? And I'm sure if they were here, they'd try and put us straight. And but my understanding is that they had a calculation that said, yes, this was a problem, but it would be a problem would only drop a plane out the sky every 2 years, I think was the figure, wasn't it? Every 2 years. And I imagine that they thought that was an acceptable risk, and that, within 2 years, they'd have come up with a patch that would make that not happen. And if you've got a 50-50 chance, it might be 4 years before the next plane falls out. If the calculations were correct, although the fact that it was a couple of months later suggests they weren't correct. So I think it's that good old-fashioned Freudian psychology, projection, distortion, denial, rationalization, that whole finger crossing thing. It'll be all right. Short-termist stuff, again, ABC analysis in the short term. If everything's okay in the short term, it'll probably be okay in the medium to long term.
That'll be all right, yeah.
Bob Hope got away with it for ages, apparently.
And again, yeah, I see that. I'm sure you do as well. It'll be all right sort of mentality, when actually, the it will be all right has a sort of short lifespan to lead as well. What was interesting in the sort of one of the hearings, one of the captains of the plane said that we shouldn't be expecting pilots to compensate for flawed designs, which I thought was really interesting, because often in organisations we see that as well, where it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's sort of ergonomics on a particular machine or lack of guarding or whatever it is, and they then go on to talk about the crews would have been fighting for their lives in the fight of their lives. And I just wondered, sort of, how often have you seen that in organisations? I'm sure it's many a time, but sort of, can you think of any examples without naming and shaming?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the most obvious example would be something to do with something like PPE, isn't it? It's supposed to be the last line of defence, and anybody who knows anything about the safety hierarchy knows, in an ideal world, you won't need it at all. And you get things like, you find people are not wearing their safety specs. Why are they not wearing the safety specs? Because they're uncomfortable, they steam up, the ventilation doesn't work, they're poor quality, all that. And then they're in stores is a long walk away, and all those little itsy bits. And then somebody will say, well, why on earth we haven't upgraded these machines or put a retrofitted a guard on the machine so stuff doesn't fly out anyway? I've no idea. And it turns out, of course, that a year before, somebody said we can attach some nice loose, like perspex guards, so that if the swarf does fly out, and we should maintain the machines anyway so it doesn't. And there's a design solution staring them in the face, and always has been. You see that sort of thing quite often.
Yeah, and then also you see instances within the documentary, they talk about FOD, foreign object damage, being left within aircraft, and certainly a point I thought was interesting was the fly-by-wire. So obviously these aircraft contain, I'm sure millions of lengths of cable, and sort of one piece of shrapnel, let's call it, or shaving, can start a fire. And sort of quality was removed. So what do you think organisations can do to build in a second line of defence? So, this MCAS system was sort of one point of failure. It was a critical safety system. What do you think organisations can do in general that you see that they can build in a secondary means of failure?
Do you mean a mechanical design? Or, I mean, obviously the one I'm going to go back to, Scott, is culture, a culture of excellence, a culture of learning, a culture of empowered and engaged workers, so I mean, obviously the sorts of things that cause the broken arm and the broken collarbone and the fractured skull, trip hazards, just good old-fashioned housekeeping you often see, and obviously I'm going to make the link now with the Concorde crash, which I believe was a housekeeping issue, wasn't it? There was a foreign object thrown up from the runway into the into the engine, you know, and aviation as you know, when you've got such fine margins and such sophisticated machinery, the last thing you want is something loose, you know, not knocking around. I've got an interesting case study about, you know, of something like that. I did some work for the National Theatre once. Fabulously interesting job, but they showed me what's your last really serious incident, and they showed me what they'd done is they turned a basement into a club. You know, the trend for really grungy clubs with girders everywhere, you know, for garage music or house music. I don't know, it's all lost on me. But anyway, some thumping music that the youth would enjoy dancing to. And anyway, thumping music means vibration. So if you leave a wrench on top of a girder near the ceiling of such a place, it's not going to fall off until you put the techno house on, in which case things start jumping. And of course, when it came down and landed on somebody's head, they knew all about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously, you know, the thing is that planes vibrate.
Yeah, for sure.
They vibrate.
Yeah. Again, there was an interesting point that was made within the documentary about doing the absolute minimum. I don't know if you've seen, but I'm sure you will see at some point. I did an article on about, can you be 100% compliant 100% of the time, which naturally the answer is going to be no. It was very interesting because often the clients or the people I deal with, they have this drive for, we just need to be compliant, Scott. We just need to tell the board of directors or trustees we are compliant. And actually that sort of drove me to this sort of article and the poll that I did with regards to, is it about being safe or is it being compliant? And most people go for the compliant, and they can't even, to be honest, get to that point. And then this come back to the documentary, talking about they didn't even do the minimum. Again, within the sort of your background and your experiences, do you see people doing the minimum or not the minimum, or trying to strive for sort of excellence or best in class and that safety?
Well, my obviously my client base is skewed because nobody's going to call us in if they got that compliance-driven mindset. So I don't really work with any organisations like that by design, you know, default. But what I would say is that we all know that compliance is but base one, you know, and we know that if you've got any sort of peripatetic workforce, any sort of autonomy, compliance is discretionary anyway. And you know, compliance being base one just doesn't correlate very well with excellence. If you've got a culture that is, I've just got to get enough, then that'll bleed into everything else, and we'll just do enough to get back in the van and go home. Well, there's no excellence, there's no pride, there's no early Boeing in there at all, is there, as a rule?
No.
And how that translates into long-term success and resilience of any organization, I have no idea. I can't imagine why anybody would feel comfortable with that. It's just
not at all. Not at all. I think it's that sort of, if they tick the box, and it comes back to box ticking, which is again the wrong sort of viewpoint of looking at anything, never mind safety. But if you can tick the box, then you've done what you need to do, as opposed to going beyond the box and keeping people safe and making sure that people return home at the end of the day. What's the sort of one piece of advice that you give to leaders of organizations, Tim? So there's very much an aspect of the leader involved in this documentary, and, you know, the buck stops with you. So why don't you sort of prevent this?
You know, helpfully, the Safety Differently crowd have kind of summarised that really nicely. You know, I've had a chance. You've given me the chance to say it's about learning, it's about empowerment, it's about culture. But you know, I think an absolute key thing is the issue of dialogue, and the key question. You know, perfectly fair premise in a capitalist society that is interested in share prices and is interested in profit, and why shouldn't they be? Otherwise, why go to work? You know, why set up a company? Sorry, is, you know, I want you to make me lots of money, but I don't want you to hurt yourself or get too stressed doing that. What do you need from me? And you're asking the experts. They'll always have they'll have all the right answers and maybe a few extra ones as well, and, you know, time to negotiate and compromise. But that one, you know, that actually just keep talking, you know, just ask the experts, just set the right tone. You know, I mean, the classic one, when people ask me to boil down the whole piece is, don't keep saying, I want this doing safely, but by Friday, because you'll get it by Friday as safely as is viable. Ask, you know, I want this safely and by Friday. If that's not possible, let's get a Coke and a Mars bar and sit around the table and thrash it through, see what we can come up with. That's it, isn't it? You know, what do you think, Scott? You know,
yeah. Well, I'll bring this into land, pardon the pun. So people expect to get on a plane and they expect to get off the other side. I would say that people expect to go to work in the same way, and they expect to come home at the end of the day in the same condition, perhaps a little bit more tired than what they started the day out in. But I would say that there's that same expectation of getting to the end of your day or the end of your destination in one piece. So yeah, so I was just going to finish with some tips, and feel free to chip in, Tim. So for me, you know, health and safety at board, senior leadership is critical to health and safety management. It has to be there. Often my experience of dealing with organizations and those people is, and sometimes I've had it thrown at me, you know, we're just a bunch of volunteers, why should we be culpable or liable for something going wrong? And sort of my response to that is, well, I'm sorry, but that's a position that you hold. So, you know, it's about engaging and empowering these people and making sure that these people understand what they need to do and what they're responsible for, and making sure that you have that real top down, bottom up journey. Training, is it good enough? Often I see training in organizations that can be sort of either missing, it's not in place at all, or it's not good enough. It doesn't even cover the basics, or it perhaps does cover the basics, but you know, it's not right for the people that are in the organization. Involving employees, you know, you've got to involve employees. I used to work for the ambulance service, and I often went out in an ambulance and with paramedics, either in a car or in an ambulance, to see what they did. Because how could I do my job without those guys? I was there to support them and help them, make sure that they were safe as I could. But without getting out there and seeing that, it's very difficult. So we've got to involve employees, we've got to listen to them, include them. And I think you would more than agree with that, Tim, from what you were saying. Building a culture that includes people. So, you know, if an organization is part of a recent merger or acquisition, does the health and safety management system that you once had, is it still true? Does it still align to that organization, or does it need to be reviewed? A big one, this one for me, do what you say. I hate when people say they'll do something and then they don't do it. Don't pay lip service to health and safety. You have to do it. You have to follow through what you've said you will do. It's not a tick in the box exercise for me. It's not that thing just to sort of get other people off your back. It's about genuinely caring for people and looking after people. And that leads me on to my next point, which is far too many times in organizations, people are focused on the legal or the financial aspects as opposed to the moral aspects. And health and safety, fundamentally, if you strip it right back, I'm sure you'll agree, Tim, right back to its sort of basics and you know, its beginnings. It's about caring for employees and other people. So don't just think around about what's the legal duty or what it's going to cost you. It's putting yourself in other people's shoes, isn't it? And finally,
oh, sorry, I was going to say I couldn't agree more, but
yeah. Go on, yeah, go on.
No, and finally, Scott.
And finally, you know, people are more important than profits, I would say. Doesn't matter how big your reputation is. As we've seen in this documentary, it takes 10 seconds or less for your reputation to be in smithereens. So, you know, that's my sort of summary of our articles and of the documentary and our sort of short chat this evening. I think it's a documentary that's a warning to any current or future leaders with regards to greed and disrespect of employees and customers. And at the end of the day, it's about long-term value and investment in safety and health, and make sure that people go home. And I did a business management degree at university, and I think this is a firm investment that if you look after people, then, as Richard Branson says, they'll look after you. So I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that, Tim.
No, I agreed with every word. Every word you said, Scott. I had one question for you, which is, what do you know? Have you covered what you thought was the key message of the film for you?
I believe so. Yeah. For me, you know, there was various. I was trying to look for the root causes, and I don't think we could cover off in the sort of half an hour, 40 minutes of all the root causes. But you know, the piece about blaming other people. You and I both know within any incident investigation, you're trying to keep blame out of it. You're trying to find the root cause of what went wrong, rather than the easy option is just to blame somebody else because it sort of absolves you of responsibility. But actually, it's never going to absolve you of responsibility because it's going to come back to you in the end anyway, because you're accountable. Then we talked about greed. As I've just said, greed is greed, and money in the short term sounds like a great thing, but in the long term, I think I totaled it up. I think the organization have paid something in the region of 60 to 70 billion dollars, which is a huge sum. I think that probably equates to something like 80, 90 odd aircraft that they would have had to sold. But then there is a reputational damage which you and I will never get to the end of, for that as well. So yeah, I think we've covered all the things that we sort of or I wanted to go through. It was really around about our own experiences and what we've seen in as professionals out there in organizations, and watching this documentary. How clear in an hour and a half does it bring what we do on a daily basis to somebody's forefront of their mind?
Yeah, I think it's a fabulous case study, and a final. I know we need to stop, otherwise we'll hit half an hour, and every listener will have long gone in this modern age. But I think Sidney Dekker makes a really good point about the third set of victims. There's the direct victims, and there's their family and friends. But a lot of people who worked for Boeing and went home with a jaunt in their step every night, having done a really good job and feeling really good about themselves and really proud about the company they worked for, who clearly started not to do that. And that just eats away at your soul, doesn't it? Mm. And it's all those thousands and thousands of people who are just less thriving than they could have been. We're not going to get into well-being and mental health, and although we should, but we're not. So my final comment would be, if everything we've said doesn't sound really simple and straightforward, then we've not explained it very well, because I think it is. But if it also doesn't sound like bloody hard work and involving lots of commitment, then the listener hasn't understood it, or something like that.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And yeah, go and check it out. It's on the very famous streaming service, of which I won't name, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks
Can we
very
not
much.
mention Netflix?
You have now. Thanks so much. Cheers. Bye.